For generations, the Monongahela River Valley had been a patchwork of quiet farms and wooded hills. Then, in the late 1800s, prospectors' picks struck something far more valuable than soil. Deep beneath those gentle slopes lay some of the richest bituminous coal seams in Pennsylvania. The discovery ignited a fever, drawing railroads and investors to the sleepy valley. In 1901, that industrial promise was given a name and a map, Donora. The new town was carved from the riverbank, its streets laid in a grid that pointed directly toward the water and the rail lines. It was built with a single purpose, to house the workers who would feed the furnaces of the coming steel mills. Men arrived by the trainload, seeking steady paychecks in the roaring new plants. They built clapboard houses on the hillsides, their windows looking down not on fields, but on the emerging skeletons of blast furnaces and the constant coal-dusted traffic of barges on the river. The valley's character had been irrevocably forged in steel and smoke. The promise of those industrial jobs was kept. By the 1910s, the American Steel and Wire Company's sprawling plant had risen along the riverbank, its skeletal framework and towering smokestacks dominating Donora's skyline. The constant clang of machinery and hiss of steam became the town's new heartbeat, a rhythm of progress that promised prosperity for every family that had settled there. Then the zinc works opened nearby, adding its own complex of furnaces and chimneys to the landscape. Day and night, thick plumes of smoke poured from the stacks, merging into a single, permanent grey veil that hung over the valley. For the residents, this industrial exhalation became as familiar as the river's flow, a sign their town was working. That smoke carried a tangible residue. A fine, gritty soot settled everywhere, on the windowsills of homes, across freshly hung laundry, and into the lungs of children playing in the streets. It was the unavoidable dust of modern life, brushed off with a sigh, a small price to pay for the paychecks that now fed the town. The familiar plume of smoke that had drifted over Donora for decades was not just soot. Inside the American Steel and Wire plant and the neighbouring zinc works, furnaces devoured tons of high-sulfur coal each day. With every shovelful fed into the flames, sulfur within the coal bonded with oxygen, transforming into an invisible, acrid gas, sulfur dioxide. But the poison was not gaseous alone. The intense heat also vaporized trace metals embedded in the ore and coal. As the vapors cooled in the towering smokestacks, they condensed into a fine, metallic dust. Microscopic particles of zinc, cadmium, and lead solidified, each one a tiny, toxic shard light enough to float for miles on the slightest breeze. On most days, these particles and gases simply dispersed, carried away by the wind, leaving only a grimy film on windows. The danger remained suspended, diluted in the vast sky. But the stage was now set. The mills had manufactured the poison. All it required was the right atmospheric cage to concentrate it, to turn the air itself into a lethal brew. The familiar industrial haze that had hung over Donora for decades thickened on that Tuesday morning. But this was different. A high-pressure system pushed a blanket of warm air down over the valley, where it met the cooler, heavier air hugging the riverbanks. This temperature inversion acted like a glass lid placed over a simmering pot, sealing the town inside. Beneath that lid, the routine emissions from the steel mill and zinc plant had nowhere to go. The sulfur dioxide gas and fine metallic dust, which normally rose and dispersed, now pooled and concentrated. They mixed with the autumn moisture in the air, beginning to form a visible, acrid fog that clung to the hillsides of Donora and Webster. By late afternoon, the trapped air had become a stagnant, toxic reservoir. The inversion layer, now firmly locked in place, prevented any wind from sweeping the valley clean. Every puff from the smokestacks, every particle of soot and metal simply sank back down, saturating the breathable space where 14,000 people lived and worked. The inversion lid clamped down tighter on Wednesday. What had been a haze thickened into a viscous, yellowish-grey fog that swallowed the valley whole. Streetlights at noon cast only faint, sickly halos in the gloom. The air no longer smelled merely of industry. It reeked of rotten eggs, the sharp, acrid bite of sulfur dioxide that seared the nostrils and scraped raw the back of every throat with each shallow breath. Inside homes, the poison seeped through every crack. A housewife wiping her kitchen table found her cloth smearing a greasy grey film. Children sent home from school coughed in ragged fits, their small chests heaving. Yet through the windows, the silhouettes of the mill stacks remained, darker smudges against the universal grey, pumping their endless contribution into the stagnant, suffocating air. The mills themselves operated in an eerie, muffled world. Workers on the factory floors squinted through the indoor murk, the external fog having infiltrated the vast buildings. The constant industrial roar was dampened, as if the smog itself was a soundproofing blanket. For the companies, it was just another shift. The economic machinery of coal, steel, and zinc ground on, blind to the biological machinery it was slowly choking to a halt outside its walls. As the sulphurous fog thickened on Thursday, the first victims were those whose bodies were already under siege. In homes across Donora, elderly residents and people with asthma or heart conditions felt their chests tighten into a vice. The invisible metal particles and acidic gas inflamed their airways, triggering violent coughing fits that stole what little oxygen remained in the poisoned air. One by one they collapsed in their kitchens and parlours, gasping for breath that would not come. The town's 8 doctors were swamped, their telephones ringing without pause. They raced between house calls, navigating streets where visibility had dropped to a few feet. Ambulances crawled through the gloom with headlights blazing, their sirens muffled by the dense yellow haze. Inside the vehicles, attendants worked frantically over patients whose lips were turning blue, administering what little relief they could with primitive oxygen tanks as the vehicles inched toward the overwhelmed hospital. With the hospital corridors overflowing, the community centre was hastily converted into a triage ward. Volunteers laid out cots and mattresses on the floor as doctors and nurses, their faces masks of exhaustion, moved from one wheezing patient to the next. The air inside grew thick with the sound of laboured breathing and the smell of disinfectant, a desperate refuge from the toxic siege that still pressed against the windows. As the death toll mounted, the town's funeral director faced an impossible task. His small parlour could not hold the bodies arriving from homes and the overwhelmed hospital. With no other space available, he began moving the deceased into his own garage, lining them up on the cold concrete floor. The scale of the disaster had shattered any semblance of normal procedure. At the zinc works, managers finally grasped the magnitude of the crisis unfolding just beyond their gates. On Saturday, October the 30th, after 4 days of lethal fog, an order was given. The massive sintering process, the operation that baked zinc ore and released the heaviest metal-laden fumes, ground to a halt. The great smokestacks fell silent, but the poison already filled the valley. That evening, the weather finally shifted. A low-pressure system moved in, bringing winds and a steady cleansing rain. It washed the soot from the leaves and windows, and it broke the suffocating inversion lid that had trapped the town. For the first time in 5 days, the people of Donora could take a deep breath of air that didn't burn. The rain that finally washed the poison from the air on Saturday night left behind a town in shock. By Sunday morning, the true scale of the horror began to emerge. In homes across Donora, families counted their losses. 20 people had died in just 3 days, most of them elderly or with pre-existing heart or lung conditions, their bodies overwhelmed by the toxic assault. But the dead were only the most visible victims. Doctors moved through the streets, their clinics still overflowing. They tallied over 6,000 sickened residents, nearly half the town's population. Hundreds coughed with a deep, rattling persistence, a sign of damage that would linger for years, scarring lungs and weakening hearts long after the fog had lifted. Outside, a silent testament to the poison's reach littered the ground. Investigators arriving in the clear daylight found sparrows and pet cats lying dead on sidewalks and porches, creatures with smaller, more vulnerable respiratory systems that had succumbed first. Their still forms were stark evidence that the killer haze had touched every living thing in the valley. The rain had washed the poison from the air, but it couldn't erase the questions hanging over Donora. Within weeks, federal investigators descended on the quieted mills. They wore suits, not uniforms, and carried clipboards instead of medical bags. Their mission was forensic, to dissect the very atmosphere that had killed 20 people, tracing death back to its invisible source. For months, teams from the U.S. Public Health Service combed through plant records, measured residue on windowsills, and interviewed hundreds of survivors. They mapped the weather patterns against the zinc plant's production logs. A clear correlation emerged. The highest death rates clustered directly downwind of the plant's towering smokestacks during those 5 stagnant days. Their final report, published in 1949, delivered a historic verdict. The killer was not the fog itself, but a specific chemical cocktail, sulfur dioxide gas and metallic fumes, primarily from the zinc plant's sintering process, concentrated by the temperature inversion. It was one of the first official documents in American history to conclusively link industrial air pollution with mass death. The Public Health Service report landed like a bomb in 1949. Newspapers across the country splashed the story of the Pennsylvania town poisoned by its own air. For the first time, a federal investigation had definitively linked industrial emissions to mass death. Donora was no longer just a local tragedy. It became a national symbol of a growing, invisible threat. That symbol galvanized action. In 1950, scientists, doctors, and public officials gathered in Washington for the first National Conference on Air Pollution. The data from Donora sat at the center of every discussion, a grim case study providing the hard evidence that had been missing. Lawmakers now had a concrete event to point to, a disaster that demanded a federal response. That response finally took shape 13 years later. The Clean Air Act of 1963 and its much stronger amendments in 1970 established the first enforceable national air quality standards. The legislation didn't mention Donora by name, but its foundation was built on the 20 lives lost there, turning a town's tragedy into a shield for the entire nation.